this computer. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. There we go. Ta-da. Okay, good. Now, let's do this. We'll talk about this slide last, but more importantly, I want to talk about class participation. Oh, we have Jesse in class as well. Now, in your course outline, there's a little blurb on class participation, okay? This thing is worth 20 marks. It's important. So first concept here is attendance does not equal class participation. Attendance is attendance, and if you've noticed, there's no mark component for attendance. Okay. Second thing, if there's positive class participation, which means you're engaging, you're answering questions, you're asking questions, you're reflective of what's going on, positive and consistent participation. Oh, I'm sorry, I did not do that. If somebody did that, could you please undo that? Or maybe it was me, I don't know. All right, let's try this one more time. Okay, there we go. Positive participation. I must have pressed something, but I know it's possible to change these things because I've accidentally done it to people in the past. Positive participation is participating regularly in most of the classes with comments, answering questions, or asking relevant questions. So it's out of 20, you'll get anywhere between 15 to 20, okay? That's the score you can expect for positive participation. Inconsistent positive participation, you say a thing once in a while, but you're consistently in class. That would get you anywhere from 10 to 14, okay? If you have difficulty showing up to class consistently, either online or you're not really contributing, you occasionally show up, we don't know that you exist because we can see your name, but we don't know if you're actually listening to stuff or if you're gone watching something on TV. We don't know that, right? So if you're not engaging consistently in class, you're there but not there, that's going to lead anywhere from 5 to 10. Obviously, if you're absent most of the time and missing everything, then your marks will be 0 to 5. Okay, so this is something I want you to remember. So it's not that not all of us are going to have wonderful comments for every class, and I understand that. But there is room for all of you to participate, ask questions, comment on what somebody else said, and the reason, and I'll tell you why this is important, because it's not that I want you to fill up my class hour with your comments, because that's not what we're going for. What we're going for is, for me, this is a gauge of how much of the content are you absorbing. Now, I have made the midterm extraordinarily easy by not just telling you where the questions will come from, but even giving you the answers to the questions. And the idea is not that you'd have a bird exam. The idea is that even by virtue of going through the question pool, you are going to learn a lot. Whether you like it or not, you're going to learn a lot, okay? But that doesn't mean you disengage from the process of active learning and actually getting the best out of this course. And so the attendance is not, the class participation mark is not meant to be punitive, but it is meant for you to engage actively with the content. And that's the idea of keeping it this way. Now, we didn't break up the class participation mark before this point. So here is the equivalent of clemency to everybody. You're all going to get to start building up your class participation mark from this point on. For those of you who've been actively participating before, we will consider that as bonus credit towards your class participation, okay? Any questions, concerns? Okay. I think everyone gets the message, so we will continue. Let's talk about today's lecture. We are now on chapter 6, and we're looking at selecting a research design. We've done everything before this, talk about variables, talk about measurements, and all of that fun stuff, okay? In the end, we really have to pick what we're going to study. So what determines research design? So let's talk about research designs, very broad strokes. We're not going into something very complicated. What are the different kinds of research designs that we can have?
Quantitative or qualitative?
Excellent. So you can have quantitative. We can have qualitative. Can anyone think of a third type?
Mixed.
Yes, thank you. I know you've heard this thing dozens of times because you've also done research. Most of you have done research literacy as well. Okay, so these are, so how do you pick? Which one do you want? Well, is this better? Is this better? Is this what you need? How do you pick your research design?
Is it according to which one will best answer your research question?
What best? Thank you, Connie. What best answers research question, right? Okay, good. So there are several research approaches. So depending on what you want to do, if you want to say one thing is causing the other, so we're just making this up. And I do not, a lot of the examples I give you, they're not perfect examples, but they get the point across. And we will talk about the flaws in my own examples too every once in a while and poke holes at it because, you know, I don't want to give you perfect airtight examples now. I want you to also think about it. So let's say the greater the number of calories, and if I make typos, it's not because I can't spell stuff, I'm rushing, okay? Leads to greater weight gain. Okay, so one thing leads to another. If you want to have a research design of this type, you're going to pick, you know, something that's quantitative. So the different research approaches, it depends on entirely what you're trying to ask. So some questions need rich, deep descriptive data. So you're not going to get that from here. You're going to get it from here, from qualitative research, okay? It also means you can get it from interviews or narratives or autobiographies or whatever it is. So and it also means that you're actually working with a very small group. Sometimes you want a lot of information, and in that situation, you're obviously going to go ahead and pick a quantitative approach. In qualitative data, typically what you do is you almost identify the group with specific characteristics because you are asking for a very specific question. There's really no point in asking people what the Aboriginal school system was like if they haven't experienced, sorry, what is it called? What schools were they? Yes, the residential schools. Thank you. I couldn't remember the word for the life of me. I apologize. So residential schools were particularly bad for our Aboriginal people. Now, it's really pointless asking non-Aboriginals or people who haven't lived in that environment, their experience or the trauma they faced in the residential school system. So the sample tends to be very determined. It's a very small group, and they have some typical characteristics which would feed into a certain narrative for which you're looking for answers to get an experience, right? Okay. Now, let's think about an example. Let's move this forward. If you are interested in finding about older adults immigrating to Canada, okay, there are two things. You can have data, or you can have phenomenology. For those of you who do not know, Canada for the longest time, it's changed recently, and I'll tell you what the change is. In the interest of family unification, which I think is wonderful, used to permit families to bring older adults to Canada, despite the fact that they may have been perceived to consume more resources and consume more healthcare services, which may or may not have necessarily been the case. But there's a big effort to reunify families. So if a younger family had migrated to Canada, it was you were quite able to get your parents over, and the grandparents would be with the family. More recently, what's happened is they identifying the fact that this does have an impact on resources, but they still want the family together. Canada has created something called a grandparent visa. So hypothetically, if my parents wanted to apply for a Canadian visa, they would get a visa for 10 years, which is a substantial amount of time that they can come and visit. Okay, so there are lots of accommodations, but some folks make use of the grandparent visa or immigration policies to come over, and some don't. If you were to get the data on how many older adults come in as immigrants to Canada, that is something you would get from Stats Canada. It's easy to, if without identifying the individual, they'd have numbers on how many older adults came. If you wanted to identify, because there is a difference in how many older adults come and decide to stay, and some just choose to visit. What is the phenomena? Why don't a whole bunch of older adults want to come and live in Canada? Is it, whether is it roots in the home country? Is it community? Is it identity? Or a loss of it when they come here? So there are many factors, right? What does it say about social ties and connections? So those are something you can only express or understand if you do a phenomenological study. So Tally's Corner is a place in Alabama. Liba was a famous sociologist who decided to try to study. Tally's Corner was an area in Alabama with a lot of African Americans who, there was a lot of poverty, a lot of suffering, a lot of misery. Liba was a white person, so he obviously didn't necessarily understand what it meant to be Black and poor. Okay, at the height of the civil rights movement, there was no understanding. There was a recognition that Black people are different. Now, those of you who don't know, the United States had a massive civil rights movement in the 60s led by Martin Luther King. Is anybody not kind of sort of aware of that? And it started off, essentially what was happening was there was a lot of segregation in the southern states in USA. And white people did their own thing. Black people were forced into these ghettoized communities. So Levi was a researcher who was interested in finding out what it meant. And at the height of the civil rights movement, there's no understanding of the African American reality, their perception of the world, their perception of their environment around them. So he decided to go and try to find out. So he went in with no preconceived ideas, and he would develop questions as his information progressed. So he actually lived in Tally's Corner. He actually lived with African American families, attempting to understand their experiences. It can't be truly called participant observation because you can't genuinely participate as a Black person being white, right? Unless you want to pull a Justin Trudeau. But anyway, that aside, you can't actually do that. But still, it was a good attempt to go in with a bunch of interviews, okay? So doing that kind of research is more of a qualitative research. When you start to talk about relationship between variables, relationship with X going up related with Y going up, that's a relationship for X versus Y, and so on. The more study you have, the better academic performance is, and so on. These are, again, these kinds of things are more of a quantitative research example. Okay. Obviously, if you start to operationalize, which is an important word. So you measure the hours and you have exam results. Okay. Now, there are different kinds of relationships that you can have between variables. This is we're talking about more of quantitative, but you can have causal relationships identified when you do qualitative studies as well. The decision to migrate to Canada, and you're having interviews, and people often say, well, most of my family is in Canada. I don't want to stay in India. I mean, I'm happy to be in Canada, right? So you can find causal relationships in qualitative studies as well through interviews. But typically when we talk about causation, cause and effect, and you have large numbers pointing to distinct causes, it comes in quantitative research. Sometimes variables, you have X and Y, but the relationship between them is mere association. Let's pick up an example. Okay. Hours of study. Marks on exam. I know we have presented this as an example of cause and effect, but it doesn't have to be. And I think some of you have pointed out earlier that they could merely be associated. Why may it not be cause and effect? Why can't you say for a fact that the more each student studies, a student studying 10 hours a week is likely to get lower marks, or will definitely get lower marks than a student studying 20 hours a week. And both of them will score lower than somebody studying 30 hours a week. Why can't we say that for a fact?
Quality of study.
Excellent. Yeah. Have focused for you when you study.
Some people just don't perform well on tests.
Exam performance, that's absolutely. Some people are not great exam performers.
That person's aptitude for the subject.
Aptitude, wonderful. Yep.
Number of distractions while studying.
Yeah, and this ties in with the quality of study, but it is different too. So we'll put it as a different one. Okay.
How about comprehension level?
Comprehension level. Yeah, because you can prepare really hard, but you don't actually understand. How about previous experience in that area?
Would it depend on the exam too? Like, what if it was multiple choice and someone just guessed all the answers, but they didn't study and they got perfect?
Oh, you're thinking type of exam, the style of exam, which isn't helpful? Is that what you're thinking?
Well, like, if something's multiple choice, there's always a chance that someone guesses all the correct answers without having studied at all.
Right. So you're thinking about a lucky high score because they guessed a lot of things correctly.
Yeah.
Okay. Luck is a
Also,
factor.
I think whose second language is English would have more difficulty than someone whose first language is English. If that's what the course is being taught in.
Possible, absolutely.
They might have to spend more time looking up words and stuff.
Yeah. So there's more time and effort trying to understand, and even if you understand everything, expressing yourself in a language is a different ball game altogether. English, English isn't my first language, and I often, well, now it is because I've been speaking it for a long time, but my initial thoughts as a younger person were often in a different language. Then I'd have to translate it into English and then say it out. So it's definitely a challenge. Okay, so as you can see, even though it looks like there's a cause and effect, there really could be a lot of different factors that throw these results out of the window. So hypothetically, I'm assessing my research methods course using my midterm exam. And if students don't do exceptionally well, it could be this, any of these, or a combination of a lot of these, okay? So a lot of times two variables can be merely associated. We didn't add a couple more things. What if they are on, different people have different physical and mental health status? What if they were ill before the exam, right? What if they're ill during the exam? What if somebody in the family is ill and they've had to, go help and they're stressed out because of that? So many factors. The point is there can be a ton of different factors which make causation or a cause and effect very, very hard to determine. Even though you'll find positivists, positivists are the bunch of scientists who always claim there's a cause and there's an effect and we can prove it. A lot of it is bullshit, and you have to read things carefully. And I know I said bullshit on camera, and it's going to be in the slides, but let's not worry about that too much. Okay. So despite the fact that we understand that there's no significant cause and effect, I think if we were to say, in a hypothetical situation, more percentage study. So if you were to increase your study by doubling, it would result in greater marks for yourself. So greater percentage increase in marks. And I think that might be a more fair way of measuring this, greater percentage marks. So if you were a person who typically studies 5 hours a week, and you get a certain mark, if you doubled it to 10 hours, you can see a greater percentage increase in marks. Now, this takes away the fact that you could be brilliant, your mental abilities are different from others. This takes away the fact that you generally don't do well on exams, because you're measuring you to you. You're measuring your own percentage to your own percentage increase in marks. And that might be a different way to do it, which basically helps address the issue that getting more marks with more study isn't pure coincidence, right? Otherwise, we saw the list of different factors that could completely confound the results. So my 10 hours of study is not going to be equivalent to my colleagues' 10 hours of study, is not going to be equivalent to a master's student's 10 hours of study, is not going to be equal to an undergraduate's 10 hours of study or a high school student's 10 hours of study. It's all different, and there are different factors that play into how you study, how well you study, how focused you are, what you understand, your comprehension, and all of those things. But if you look at, if I study and I'm for a test for 10 hours and I get a certain score, similar comparable test, I study for 15 hours and it's a 50% increase and my test marks are up by 20, 25%, 50%, whatever it is, there is a correlation to more hours of study with more marks in the exam, right? And that kind of, it just makes the point that the relationship is not just coincidental. Otherwise, it's easy to say that, well, pretty much everything quantitative scientists do is bullshit because there could be a lot of factors to explain the phenomena, right? So let's look at examples of non-causal relationship. And I think we did one already, which is the hours of study and exam mark. Calories and weight gain. If two people, or we have a bunch of people, A to Z, 26 letters of the alphabet, 26 people, whatever it is. Each of them consumes 2,000 calories a day. Or let's not say 2,000 calories. We don't know how many. Perhaps many calories. Greater the number of calories, greater the weight gain. Okay. Why might this be an example of a non-causal relationship? Don't you think if someone consumes more calories, they should get heavier, larger?
Kind of depends on metabolism, doesn't it? Like if a larger person would need more calories just to maintain their weight.
Correct. Excellent.
Also,
Go, Cassie.
I was going to say where the calories are coming from. So what type of food they're eating.
You might want to explain that for the class, Cassie. What do you mean? Which calories would contribute to weight gain in your opinion, and which kind of calories would not?
Okay, so whole foods, your clean proteins and fruits and vegetables have calories in them, but they're good calories versus something like French fries, where you have high fat content, low nutritional content.
Thank you. So yeah, that I just asked Cassie to expand on that because I'm not sure how many of you have taken the nutrition course or what each person's level of understanding of nutrition itself is. Okay, but at the same time, so these are two confounding factors. Any other factors which tell you that this may be non-causal? activity levels.
Doesn't take into account exercise.
Thank you, Connie. Yeah, exactly. Activity/exercise. So metabolism, I'm just going to expand on that. It's not just the size of the person, but also their basal metabolic rate. Now, I have a friend called Melissa Botonic. She has always been lean. She's similar in age to myself. She's probably a year younger. A very lean person. She can eat a lot of food, drink a lot of alcohol, and she remains lean without any exercise or physical activity. And it blows my mind, and I'm truly envious because I can't get away with that. Okay, but that's not always the case. That's because my good friend Melissa has a fantastic metabolism. She just burns calories all the time. She's never cold. Middle of winter, she's warm because her body is practically a furnace. It's burning energy and she's warm all the time. Anyway, so your metabolic rate has a lot to do with how many calories you burn. Anything else? I would go ahead, Jesse. Health conditions. Do you want to expand on that? What are you thinking, Jesse?
Like personally, like my family, diabetes is a big problem with my family.
Okay.
And maintaining a healthy weight is a hard time because the insulin and food intake is so up and down with my family that there's always struggles.
Messes up insulin levels. 100%. It's difficult when you have health conditions, both physical and mental. And one of the things people don't think about is people often on medication for mental health challenges have a harder time maintaining a healthy weight because a lot of these medications actually dull your sense of fullness. It causes lower metabolic rate and greater consumption of food. Okay, people who have hypothyroid conditions, which means their thyroid gland, which is one of the key, it produces thyroid hormone, it keeps you active, it keeps your metabolism going. Some people, their thyroid gland just doesn't produce enough thyroxine. Okay, so it makes them feel like they're low on energy, it gets them more hungry. So there are a lot of different factors that we have to consider when we talk about calories and weight gain. Thinking anything else? Sleep, stress and sleep. People are constantly stressed. Sleep, okay. People who are constantly stressed produce a high amounts of hormones called cortisols. So what happens is if you are constantly under stress, you produce these hormones which actually slow down your metabolic rate in your body. Okay. As a result of slowing down your metabolic rate, you might not be eating a lot of food, but your body's not burning things easily either. So people under constant stress often have considerable difficulty maintaining body weight. Okay. People who don't sleep well also have difficulty maintaining body weight. And the reason, interestingly, is exactly the same. People who consistently don't sleep well, if you're only able to capture a few hours of sleep every night over a several year period, your body produces a lot of cortisols again. And that basically slows your metabolic rate down. So these are examples of non-causal relationships. And as much as we'd like to say, well, don't eat so much food to someone who needs to lose weight, first of all, please never say that. But in the event that you feel extremely tempted to, think about all of these other factors that impact the ability to maintain a healthy body weight.
Does it also make a difference what time of day you eat?
What time in the day? We never thought about that. Yes, time of day is important, 100%, because that affects metabolism. It's often recommended that you don't eat close to bedtime, and the reason is sleeping doesn't really burn too many calories. So all of the food that you eat very close to bedtime tends to get stored, right? So thank you, Samantha. That was a good example. Okay, mental health and stress. Or stress and mental health. Is there a cause and effect relationship here? What do we think? I mean, I said it's non-causal, so I already gave the answer away. Why is it non-causal?
I think it's definitely associated sometimes, but
Yep.
there are many variables on both sides.
And I'm looking for the variables.
The mental health issues may be chemical, and
Okay, yeah, they can be biochemical, 100%. But does everyone under stress go through mental health problems? That's the first question. When we say it's a non-causal relationship, everyone's under stress, right? Like you're all students, you have constant assignments, an example. All of you are under stress, okay? Does everyone need the same kind of additional support tools? Is everyone the same amongst your peers, amongst your friends? Is everyone different? Okay, so those differences are the variables, so are the changes, are the non-controlled variables, so to speak, right? So
right.
Some people say they thrive in stressful situations.
Mhm.
yeah, some people perform well under stress. Okay, go ahead, Courtney. Level of stress so Courtney says chronic stress as opposed to healthy stress. Chronic stress versus a healthy level of stress. The opposite of chronic is always acute. Acute stress means you just find out your credit card's been hacked and now you owe $15,000 just before showing up to your midterm exam. I hope this doesn't happen to anyone of you. I'm not jinxing anybody here. I'm just saying you're walking into your midterm, you get a call from your bank saying your credit card has now been canceled and you owe them $15,000. Okay, that would be acute stress. And the reason it would be acute stress is because it's a massive problem. It's absolutely horrible. But someday it's going to get resolved, maybe in a couple of days, maybe a week, whatever it is. And then that stress is gone. Okay, it's been intense, it's been around, it's gone. Chronic stress is, I'm a student at Laurentian for 4 years. My folks don't have money. I have to depend on part-time jobs to pay my tuition and support myself. And it's always tight. You're constantly stressed for money over a 4-year period. Chronic stress, okay? So it's not a massive amount of stress, but it's chronic. Some people have acute and chronic combined, which is a really bad situation. But most people have some amount of healthy stress in their day-to-day lives. It keeps us going, it keeps us motivated. Unhealthy stress obviously is a problem. We didn't take into factor individual coping skills. People have different abilities to cope, right? Everybody's not the same. People come in with different advantages that they've picked up throughout their lifespan. Several young people are fortunate that they have strong built-in capacities because of the kind of parenting they received, the kind of schools they were at, their constant exposure to not just to stress, but to mechanisms, exposure to mechanisms on how to deal with the stress, right? So it's a lot of different factors that suggest that mental health and stress may not be a cause and effect relationship.
Another thing where they're tied together is that people with mental health issues are often on medication, and the medication can help you deal with more stress than even a normal person without a mental health issue would have. And just having that medication increases the ability to handle stress.
And I tend to agree, and I know this from personal experience. my son is he needed medication to help him with his behavioral challenges, and it was good, except that he was always a little foggy because that's what the meds had to do. But it helped him with behavioral management, and it was very supportive, and it was a blessing in his situation. He was actually better behaved than children who weren't on anything often. So it's because he wasn't stressed, and there can be many examples of this. I'm just picking up a personal example because I can't think of different kinds of examples at the moment. But yeah, so there's a lot of connection. Now, the next example is going to be quite interesting. Again, example of a non-causal relationship: income and debt. Okay. It's incredible how many people who make large pots of money, huge income, are actually in a greater amount of debt. They owe more. People who make millions owe money in the tens of millions. Oftentimes, people who make a smaller paycheck don't have that degree of debt. So again, it's an example of a non-causal relationship. Now,
Would spending be the confounding variable?
Sorry, what's that again?
Would spending be the confounding variable?
Yeah, the spending, and spending beyond means, more importantly, right? So I have a lot of friends who are physicians, and physicians, as we know, and we rail about, I'm not, when I say we, as in people complain about how much money physicians make. There's a considerable amount of disposable income. Okay, the salaries are typically, if you're a specialist, you're talking about a couple $1 million a year. When you make that kind of money, there's this, the banks are happy to lend you a lot of money. So I have acquaintances and friends who make millions of dollars a year. But the issue is they also have millions and millions of dollars in debt, because banks are happy to lend them money, because banks are happy to see that they can actually loan a lot of money, and even at low interest, they make a lot of money, and they know that the money will keep coming because physicians continue to make money, right? So these individuals have a lot of debt. Everything is fine till it isn't. So very recently, one of my physician friends, who's also exceptionally wealthy, popped one of the discs in his back. So he's a cardiovascular surgeon. He needs both his hands. The back was fixed. However, he lost functionality well, his hand is still functional, but it shakes. It has tremors. So he can no longer operate. So now what do you do with that debt? Because if you can't operate, you're not bringing in the same kind of money as you did when you could operate. You're left to being a consultant and an educator and a teacher. It's completely a hands thing. Now, he did have insurance on his hands, which was a wise thing to do, and that takes care of a lot of payments. And physicians, especially specialists, surgeons who use their hands a lot, will actually insure their body parts, right? Especially their hands, because you can't operate if you don't have complete functionality. You can't operate if you can't stand up. You can't be on a wheelchair and operate. You can't work in the operating. So they'll insure different, various body parts, and they pay big insurance premium for that. But so it does get crazy. So income and debt are not necessarily causal, although it's easy to assume that if you're middle or low income, you're likely to have more debt, which is not really the case. Lots of people who have very small incomes are actually debt-free and live very sufficient, suitable lives. Okay. Cause and effect can only be argued. Each of these can be made into a cause and effect relationship. You can demonstrate calories and weight gain under a certain set of circumstances when your sample has people of the same gender. Gender is important because males tend to have a higher basal metabolic rate than females. In general, not always, okay? Say similar BMR, similar sizes. So you can't compare someone who's 6'4" to someone who's 5'3". They will not have the same response to a certain amount of calories that they consume. Similar activity levels. similar types of calories. I think Cassie brought that up, different types of calories, and that's true. And that list can go on. So all of these different variables which change the results that you can find are called control variables. And we have spoken about them previously. I can't remember which lecture it was, but we've spoken about control variables before. I think it was in the chapter that dealt with variables, the lecture that dealt with variables. So whenever you want to suggest a causal relationship and you want to actually demonstrate that it's truly causal, you have to make many other confounding variables the same before you can actually make that comment. So if you want to talk about students receiving more or performing better on exams because they study more, you actually have to take students with similar backgrounds, similar mental ability. So you might have to do an aptitude test first to figure out what their aptitudes are, what their IQ levels are, what their EQ levels are, and so on. So you know where they're at mentally, you know what their background is, and then you have some students study more and some students study less, and those might not be the end of all the control factors. There might be even more control variables that you might need to control for. Okay, and assuming they take the test under very similar circumstances, what would happen is you could actually suggest a cause and effect relationship. So talking about research designs, there are different types of research designs, and this is mostly to deal with quantitative. So we'll not a simple case study is one type of research design. You're looking at what is happening, what is a phenomenon. And when we talk about phenomenon here, this may just be a bunch of observations. We're not necessarily looking at phenomenology as to why a certain thing happens. You're just looking at a certain phenomenon. And we'll go through examples in a couple of slides. A longitudinal study asks the question, what is happening to a certain quantity with a change in time? For example, how has the median income for families in Greater Sudbury changed from 1980 to 2020? So it's a 40-year period. You're looking at change in median income in families. That would be a longitudinal study. A comparison study is, let's compare the median income of all cities, families in all cities in Canada with a population of greater than 100,000. That would be a comparison study. Then there's a combination of the comparison study and the longitudinal study. It's called the longitudinal comparison study. So you might be interested in finding out what the median income of a family is in cities over 100,000 people starting in 1980. So now you're tracking the change in median income for families over a 40-year period. And the last type of study is called an experiment study. An experiment study is you try to see if there is a role, your role as researcher, in introducing something and if it changes how people feel. For example, if you want to do an experiment to understand whether your age sensitization technique is helping cashiers at Walmart. Okay, let's hypothetical situation. You walk into Walmart and you speak to the manager and say, I'm really interested in a project and you'd be contributing to my learning as a student. This is Walmart's opportunity to engage with the community and help students out. Would you do it? And the Walmart manager, nice person, says, yeah, sure, go ahead. So you tell them what the study is about, and then you decide that you're going to have 2 sets of cashiers come in, and we're going to do, or maybe 1 set of cashiers come in, and we're going to have them take a pre-test, and we show them, ask them a bunch of questions, and hopefully they're smart enough so that we don't end up asking questions like, are you ageist? But we have a bunch of questions on their aptitude study, and we determine what we see as an acceptable or unacceptable score, or whatever. They have a numerical number on their aptitude test, and it suggests that there's a certain level of ageism that's going on. Now, what you do is you go through your little seminar and you talk about how you work with older adults and how each one of them is different. Not all of them are have all the time in the world to sit and talk to you. They will not talk your ears out, whatever it is. You know, you have your little presentation, you have a bunch of older adults come and do their thing, and then you administer your same aptitude test to these cashiers later, okay? And then you find that the score has changed because now they're more age sensitive as opposed to being a little disconnected from older adults. So that would be the example of an experiment, okay? So your A would be before, and then it could change after. Or you could have two different groups of cashiers, one group of cashiers who hasn't done a sensitization seminar, and the second group that's done the sensitization seminar, and the scores are different, okay? All right. So these are the 5 typical types of research design. Now, a lot of these examples can be quantitative, but that you can do qualitative studies also using these designs. It just works a little differently in terms of sample size and terms of the nature of questions asked and so on. So let's look at the first type of example. Let's look at a case study. A case study typically focuses on a single case, okay? It does not mean it's based on one person. So for example, in Sudbury, there's a place called Onaping. Onaping is a little community, former mining community. It's about 35 kilometers outside the city center here, okay? There are challenges. There used to be challenges. I don't know if they still exist. I think they might still be. With transportation from Onaping to Sudbury, there's always been transportation challenges. Okay. Now, if we were to study on the different kinds of challenges for transportation or transporting older adults to Sudbury, that would be a case study because it works on a singular entity. The findings you have, the biggest argument against case studies is that the findings from one study you cannot extrapolate to another. So the challenges faced by older residents on Onaping and getting to Sudbury are going to be quite different from older adults, say in Ajax to get to, say, Toronto or Mississauga or so on, okay? Different challenges. Case study can be qualitative or quantitative. There's really no definite reason why it has to be quantitative all the time. A case study could be qualitative as well. You talk to a bunch of individuals. I interview my students in my research methods course, asking them the reasons for taking the course. And even though they might have some similar reasons, some different reasons, the interviews might bring up a whole bunch of different topics that could easily be a qualitative study. Okay. Typically in a case study, we're not suggesting a cause or effect. There's no hypothesis to be tested. Okay, it tends to be more of a descriptive type, even when it's quantitative. So for example, even if I were to study how many hours my students in research methods put in to study for the midterm exam and look at their final grade, I don't have a hypothesis, okay? So because it's a case study, it's very small in that sense, and there's really no hypothesis, it's more of an observation that's being documented and described. Case studies typically are follow-up studies which are suggested to be causal. So my interest in doing a case study on the research methods course, I'm not doing a study. While I'm telling you all of these things, I'm not conducting a study on you without your consent. None of that is happening. But I'm just saying, hypothetically, if there were a study to interview you for the number of hours you put in for your midterm, it's because there might have been other studies before suggesting that the number of hours causes a greater amount of marks in your exams. So let's look at some challenges with case studies. I have 2 vending machines at a country club, which is frequented by older adults. Okay, and it could be a seniors club, it could be an older adults club, whatever it is. Okay, Both of them supply beverages. It is the middle of summer. Machine one dispenses pop and the other one dispenses carbonated beverage. Okay. Oh, machine one dispenses pop and other carbonated beverages. Machine two dispenses fruit juices. Okay. Interestingly, I find that machine one gets used a lot. It gets emptied all the time. Machine two barely gets empty. So what do we conclude? If I only gave you this information.
That the pop is more popular.
Okay. Pop is popular. Older adults are consuming empty calories, right?
Could be that the mechanism for taking in the price of the drink is not user friendly on number 2.
Price of juice.
I know there's one machine at work. It will not accept dollar bills. I don't even know if it will accept coins or if it's all just using a card.
Picky machines. So many reasons, right? Now, would your conclusions change? Sorry, go ahead, Samantha. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I'll mute it. I was just clearing my throat.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, but what if I now told you that machine one, which dispenses pop and carbonated beverages, is front and center right next to the entrance of the country club. And machine two, which has the juice, is actually tucked away underneath a stairwell, which you only get to see when you go to the bathroom. Would your conclusions change? Considerably, right? And Jesse says yes, because right now even though we did this case study and we found that, well, the soda and pop gets consumed more, other than having cranky machines and the price and all of that, the location is also important. So that's why you can't make a definitive conclusions a lot of times in case studies, because again, you haven't looked at every method. What if one machine had greater capacity? Let's say the juice machine had the capacity to store 500 bottles and a pop machine had the capacity to store 50 bottles. Which vending machine do you think would get refilled a lot more? Your pop machine, right? So that there are a lot of these factors. So case studies can be informative, but you have to not just draw your conclusions carefully. You're very limited in how much you can extrapolate in the case study itself. We only have 5 minutes more, and as I mentioned, we actually have 25 minutes more, but I'm going to end in 5 minutes because, well, I accidentally scheduled something after, but we'll talk about longitudinal studies a little bit, and then we'll stop. Okay, longitudinal study is what happens to the dependent variable y over time. Okay, so let's talk about different examples of a variable y. We will call this y. Y can be anything, and this is going to be a time axis. And we won't put a number to this. Okay, let's have some examples of what could change over time.
Your health.
Something measurable. What would you like to use as an example, Connie, for health? Some measurable?
Resting heart rate.
Okay. So does resting heart rate go up or go down with time?
If you're studying the same person, their age would change it.
It would change it. Okay, and if this is hypothetically, if they didn't change their activity levels, if they did exactly the same thing from day one. Okay, so we say resting heart rate here. What about muscle mass? If they did absolutely nothing, probably go down, right? That's why you get sarcopenia. We're assuming without interventions, because I'm just trying to make examples of longitudinal studies. Many things change over time, right? I mean, hopefully your bank account savings go up with time. If you're careful and you're a good investor and a good saver, it goes up with time, right? Many things change with time. Population of Canada. These are examples of longitudinal study. You track the population of a country, of a city. You track, loss in muscle mass because of a lack of intervention. Things over time, things that change over time. That's the foundation for longitudinal study. Our flexibility changes over time. So examples are here. Number of social relationship, number of births, deaths, weight loss, etc. You can have testing over a period of time as well. So for example, people who have taken many exams, many tests, their ability to take exam and tests improves with time. So that is an example.
You could also track the unemployment rate.
Sorry, what was that?
Track the unemployment rate over time.
Unemployment, yes, unemployment, absolutely. Maybe it looks like this, whatever it is, unemployment rate. So these are graphs that you see on a day-to-day basis. Your newspapers might put them out. Your stock exchange is something over time. So you look at NASDAQ or you look at the TSX. And it's all longitudinal, right? When you look at those graphs, it's over a period of time. It's an example of a longitudinal study. Anything that's done over time. Sensitization is the example for like the more courses you take in gerontology. So when you come as students before you join a gerontology program, and by the time you're done, the amount of sensitization is greater. And it is, even though time is not the independent variable here, time is a related variable. The more time you spend in the field, it's actually the amount of sensitization that makes you more sensitive, really. But there is a time component to it. So time is associated. Is time an accurate variable for the concept associated with sensitization? Probably not, but it's an associated variable, okay? So I think what we'll do now is I'll go ahead and stop lecture at this point. We will finish up on Thursday. And we'll also talk a little bit more about how, well, we have 2 more weeks for your midterm, so we won't talk about it just now in terms of how it's going to be set up and all of those things. So if anybody has any questions, we still have a couple of minutes before I'm going to disconnect. Go ahead and ask away. But if not, everyone have a good couple of days and we will see you on Thursday.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
I have a quick question. I'm not sure where it fits in our course, but I was thinking the other day, when we do studies and ask information, like say, for example, the number of hours studied, who checks that what people report is accurate, is honest? Like,
oh, we don't know. A lot of studies are self-reported studies, Connie. That's a great question. It's very hard when you use self-reported studies. For example, you're asking students how many hours they put in. It's actually very difficult to show anything. So, but the thing is, as a researcher, you would report the fact that this is a self-reported study.
Okay, so what about a study where it states in its conclusions that this was the sample was this education level, this income level? How do you check that?
You can't, because anything that's self-reported you can't verify. You are depending on the integrity of the respondent, but that's something as researcher that you would state in your limitations, that these were self-reported studies, so we have a limited way to determine how accurate they actually are. And the only way you can find truthfulness in the number of, say for example, you're saying number of hours studied versus exam performance, is that you do that study over and over many times, many samples, and if you remember from research literacy, you can triangulate, which means you see that same result consistently, not just from you, but from other sources as well, and perhaps from other experts' findings as well.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. All right, well, have a good couple of days, everybody. I will absolutely have to go at this point, okay? And we will see you all on Thursday.